I have the historic and honorific title of founding chairman of the Communist Party of the Philippines and the current working title of public intellectual, or more specifically, chief political consultant of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. Due to the cancellation of my Philippine passport by the Philippine reactionary government, I have been forced to apply for political asylum in the Netherlands since 1988. I have obtained recognition as political refugee from the Dutch Council of State since 1992. Thus, I enjoy the protection of the principle of non-refoulement under the Geneva Refugee Convention and Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. I cannot be deported to the Philippines or any third country. I have won against trumped-up charges of multiple murder since 2007 in the Dutch court system. These were instigated by the Arroyo regime. I have also won the case for the removal of my name from the EU, the European Union terrorist list, since 2009 before the European Court of Justice. In a manner of speaking, I am legally clean, and there is no hindrance to my freedom of thought and expression. My study of the history and social circumstances of the Filipino people and the old Communist Party of the Philippine Islands started in the latter half of the 1950s. When the time came in 1966 for my comrades and myself to separate ourselves from the lava revisionist clique, which was in control of the old party, we gave priority to the research for and drafting of the rectification document, Rectify Errors and Rebuild the Party, the CPP Constitution, and the Program for a People's Democratic Revolution for the purpose of re-establishing the CPP on December 26, 1968. After the re-establishment of the CPP, I proceeded to immediately do the research for, outline, and draft the Philippine Society and Revolution from May to August 1969. The PSR, or the Philippine Society and Revolution, was urgently needed to elaborate on the history, problems, and revolutionary program of the CPP, proletariat, and entire people. I let comrades read and critique the drafts until October, and within the last week of this month, the PSR was ready for mimeograph printing, chapter by chapter, by the CPP Central Publishing House. The PSR completed the process of laying the ideological and political foundation for re-establishing the CPP and resuming the People's Democratic Revolution through protracted People's War. We ceased completely the revolutionary initiative from the lava revisionist clique by producing such a book on the history of the Filipino people, Chapter 1, The Basic Problems of the People, Chapter 2, and the People's Democratic Revolution as Solution, Chapter 3, and by founding the New People's Army on March 29, 1969. We owe to the Philippine Revolution of 1896 the legacy of the Filipino people's revolutionary struggle for national independence against colonialism and for democracy, against feudalism and medievalism. But this old democratic revolution led by the liberal bourgeoisie was defeated by the war of aggression unleashed by U.S. imperialism from 1899 onward, after pretending to assist the Aguinaldo government against Spanish colonialism. The CPP has vowed to continue the Filipino people's struggle for national and social liberation as a new democratic revolution, no longer under the class leadership of the liberal bourgeoisie, but under that of the working class, in consonance with the world era of modern imperialism and a world proletarian revolution. The new democratic revolution aims to defeat imperialist domination and the local exploiting classes of big compradors, landlords, and bureaucrats, and proceed to the socialist revolution. The series of foreign dominations over the Philippines by Spanish colonialism, Japanese fascist occupation, and U.S. imperialism, plus the recent military bases of Chinese imperialism in the West Philippine Sea, has imposed a series of problems detrimental to the Filipino people, especially the toiling masses of workers and peasants. But at the same time, the Filipino people have also learned comprehensively and profoundly to wage a series of revolutionary struggles against these foreign monsters. The CPP and other revolutionary forces of the Filipino people have learned and achieved so much from these struggles that they have been able to build an armed revolutionary movement that is nationwide and intimately connected with the toiling masses of workers and peasants. After 53 years of continuous struggle, the Philippine Revolution has accumulated unprecedented strength beyond the levels of strength previously achieved since the Philippine Revolution of 1896. The Philippines remains semi-colonial because it has not yet realized full national independence. Since the 1946 nominal grant of independence, U.S. imperialism has always made sure, through unequal treaties, agreements, and arrangements, that the Philippines is politically, economically, culturally, and militarily subservient to the dictates of the U.S. The Filipino exploiting classes and the ruling system are subordinate to U.S. imperialism against the national and democratic rights of the Filipino people. The Philippines also remains semi-feudal in economic and social terms. Feudal and semi-feudal relations persist. In fact, feudal landlord-tenant relations cover more poor peasants and farm workers and hectarage. The semi-feudal relations in plantations run by agri-corporations, which have a limited number of regular wage-earning farm workers and hire low-paid seasonal farm workers only during peak harvest seasons. As a whole, the Philippine economy is run by the big comprador-landlord combine rather than by an industrial capitalist class, despite the dominance of the commodity system of production and distribution since the 19th century. The Levite revisionists could not understand how Mao earlier and I later explained that imperialism or foreign monopoly capitalism has used feudalism as a social base. The great number of people impoverished by feudal and semi-feudal relations served to provide cheap labor for any enterprise of foreign investors or big compradors, produce cheap raw materials and exotic fruits for export, consume, manufactures, from imperialist countries and so on. Like the Mongols, the Spanish colonialists and U.S. imperialists make up for their shortage of personnel by using puppets among the local rulers. That should explain easily how imperialism takes advantage of feudalism as social base. Foreign rulers in the Philippines have always depended on local puppets from the central level to the local level, especially at the local level. So, under semi-colonial conditions, the foreign ruler, like the U.S. imperialism, makes use of the landlord-based, landlord class-based politicians to run the whole country. So that shows that the landlords, as well as big compradors who are related to the landlords, help U.S. imperialism run the country. Thus, you can easily see there that the landlord big comprador base is the social base of U.S. imperialism. I have already explained that the Philippines remains politically semi-colonial, or if you wish, neo-colonial, grossly lacking full independence and principally subservient to U.S. imperialism. Now let me focus on the economic and social term semi-feudal. Let me quote a few paragraphs from my article, Semi-Feudalism in the Philippines, to give you an initial idea of semi-feudalism, and then please proceed to read the entire article. The agriculture, industry, and service sectors of the Philippines are all dependent on the importation of capital goods, as well as intermediate goods in varying degrees in order to operate. These include mechanical, electromechanical, and electronic equipment, fuels, metals, chemicals, and agricultural inputs. They are required to optimize production in the semi-feudal economy. The importation of these capital goods is paid for by the exportation of certain agricultural crops, mineral ores, semi-manufactures, and cheap labor in the form of live men and women. These exports are, however, never enough, and there is a perennial and growing trade deficit which is paid for with mounting foreign debt and direct investments, which only entrench and worsen the problem. The Philippines lacks an industrial foundation and cannot be considered industrial capitalist, despite the baseless claim of bourgeois economists that it has become a newly industrialized country. It has rich mineral resources, but these are merely extracted and exported to industrial capitalist economies. It has not developed metallurgy beyond the stage of primary processing or the mere extraction of mineral ores, and it has no capacity for producing steel and other basic metals, machine tools, precision instruments, and other basic means of industrial production. All subsectors of the economy, like mining and quarrying, construction, refining of imported crude oil, assembly of cars and ships, electronic assembly, production of cement, chemicals, and fertilizers, garments, industrial food and beverage processing, reshaping of imported plates, tubes and rods of steel and other metals, and so on, are grossly dependent on imported electromechanical equipment, fuel, and components pre-fabricated abroad. In recent decades, imported industrial inputs began to include digital tech tools, dependent on expensive software and other heavily protected intellectual property, such as patents, which are controlled by imperialist firms to prevent unauthorized technology transfer. What is passed off as manufacturing in electronics and transport equipment, cars, trucks, motorcycles, and ships is merely a reassembly of finished parts and components from abroad. What is passed off as shipbuilding is mainly welding of parts prefabricated abroad. What is passed off as steel industry is mainly the reshaping of imported metal plates, tubes, and rods. The relations of production describe best the semi-feudal character of the Philippine mode of production. The chief ruling class is no longer the traditional rent-collecting landlord class of feudal times. It is the comprador big bourgeoisie, which is the chief financial and trading agent of foreign monopoly capitalism and owns the big banks, export-import companies, shopping malls, construction, real estate companies, and the like. At the same time, it owns the largest haciendas and related agribusinesses, including livestock and poultry farms, fishing fleets, agroforestry schemes, and stocks in mining companies to assure itself of primary commodities for export in exchange for the manufactures that it imports. The comprador big bourgeoisie is often called the big comprador landlord class to emphasize its semi-feudal character, its hybrid character as merchant capitalist and feudal owner of haciendas. It engages in manufacturing, but it imports the majority of its means of production, the fuel and most major components of the total product. It uses some amount of mechanization in its haciendas, but continues to use the cheap labor of seasonal farm workers and collects from the widespread traditional rent-collecting landlords a large amount of agricultural surplus for local processing, domestic trade, and export. It has the biggest amount of bribe money to determine the big comprador character of the high bureaucrat capitalists, as well as the results of elections at the national, regional, provincial, and city levels. After the resumption of the People's War in the Philippines in 1969, it was truly challenging that the new People's Army had to grow from small and weak to big and strong in an archipelago where the main islands of Luzon and Mindanao are separated at the middle by a clutter of smaller islands called the Visayas. Some comrades complained that the NPA would have no wide spaces as in the Asian mainland for maneuverability, cross-border advantages, or any long march similar to that of the Chinese in 1935 and 1936. Specific characteristics of our People's War, an article of mine, allayed the fears of such comrades by pointing out that although the Philippines is archipelagic, it has a mountainous character. The oppression and exploitation of the people and their historical experience of armed resistance can provide depth and breadth for the People's Army from one stage of development to a higher one. Thus, the general line was set for developing the People's War in major islands first and then in the minor islands next. We developed first the armed struggle in the 11 major islands, which carried 94% of the entire population. At first, the archipelagic character of the Philippines can be disadvantageous for the small and weak NPA, but in the long run, the CPP, NPA, NDFP, the revolutionary mass organizations and organs of political power did their work to expand the armed struggle. After only the first 10 years of People's War, the NPA succeeded in spreading nationwide and developing strong links with the toiling masses of workers and peasants in most regions of the Philippines. Despite resorting to fascist dictatorship, the Marcos regime could not destroy the NPA, but was instead overthrown in 1986. The post-Marcos pseudo-democratic regimes engaged in campaigns of military suppression under U.S. direction, as well as in peace negotiations, but failed to subdue the NPA. After 53 years of People's War, the NPA has been able to build more than 110 guerrilla fronts in large areas of 74 provinces out of the 81 Philippine provinces. It is about 10,000 fighters with high-powered rifles and augmented by the People's Militia of the local organs of political power and self-defense units of the mass organizations. Let me cite how large is the People's Militia. It exists in every village where the People's Democratic Government has been set up, and it is the local police force. And the said defense units belong to the revolutionary mass organizations which coexist with the local organs of political power, and this would run into hundreds of thousands. These armed forces of the people has resulted in the rapid growth of the revolutionary mass organizations, the Alliance of Patriotic Forces, and the People's Democratic Government. The victories of the NPA are enhanced by the fact that it has seen the futility and failure of the 14-year Marcos fascist dictatorship in trying to destroy it. The dictatorship served to outrage and inspire the people to wage armed and other forms of resistance. The brilliance of the victories of the NPA is enhanced by the fact that these were won self-reliantly. The NPA had no cross-border advantages like the Chinese, Korean, and Indo-Chinese People's Armies had in the past. Worst of all, the Dengist counter-revolution in China prevailed in 1976 or even earlier, and cast away the principle of proletarian internationalism in favor of collaboration with U.S. imperialism. The oppressed nationalities and indigenous peoples in the Philippines amount to 15% of the entire Philippine population, but they occupy extensive areas of the Philippines which are hilly and mountainous. They include the Itas or Negritos, the various tribes of the Cordillera, the Muslim Moros of Mindanao, the Lumad, Mangyan of Mindoro, Tumandok of Panay, and others. Historically, they have been more resistant to westernization than the 85% of Filipinos who live on the seacoast and along the big rivers, and more exposed to the Spanish and U.S. colonial rules. Since its foundation, the CPP has included in its program for the People's Democratic Revolution the following major point. National minorities in the Philippines have been abused and grossly neglected. They can be powerful participants in the revolutionary overthrow of U.S. imperialism and feudalism. The main concern of the national minorities is land, the abuses of landlords, loggers, and land grabbers, and exploitation in mines and plantations. A new type of leadership, a revolutionary one, must be encouraged to rise among them so as to supplant the traditional leadership that has failed to protect them and has merely contributed to and participated in their exploitation. The CPP and the revolutionary movement recognize the right of the national minorities to national self-determination, including the right to autonomy in a non-oppressive Philippine state up to the right of secession or separation against an oppressive state. The National Democratic Front of the Philippines is the following organizations of national minorities among its allied 18 organizations: Moro Resistance and Liberation Organization, the Cordillera People's Democratic Organization, and Revolutionary Organization of Lumats. The oppressed nationalities uphold the right to autonomy and other democratic rights within the NDFP framework and have played a major role in developing the People's War and have made major contributions to the Filipino people's struggle for national and social liberation. Within the last decade of the 20th century, the Second Great Rectification movement was successful at repairing the serious damage done by the urban insurrectionist line in various regions and at further strengthening the guerrilla fronts on a nationwide scale and multiplying the NPA platoons and companies for the purpose of accelerating the maturation of the middle and advanced phases of the strategic defensive. Thus, the U.S. and the Arroyo regime tried to carry out focused or concentrated offensives of the reactionary armed forces and police against a series of major guerrilla fronts. The central leadership of the CPP thought of three ways to defeat the planned offensives of the enemy, which eventually rolled out as Plan Bantaylaya 2 and 3 during the 10-year Arroyo regime. The first way was to welcome the enemy offensive with landmines and sniper teams, retreat the main force of the guerrilla, deprive the enemy of a prime target, and observe how the enemy deploys his forces for the purpose of harassment and counteroffensive. The second way was for the NPA in other areas of the same guerrilla front and in other guerrilla fronts to launch their own offensives in order to distract the enemy and continue seizing arms. The third way was for the NPA to launch small but dramatic urban operations of the city partisan type in order to further distract the enemy. The first way proved successful in the long run in Mindanao and some other regions. The second way was slow, especially in the regions north of Manila. The organization of rural-based NPA units for armed city partisan type operations in the urban areas has been dormant or too slow until now, probably because the regional and central organs of leadership have been unable to provide the command to coordinate the rural-based and urban-based regional leaderships. There might also have been a problem of defining the physical and personality targets on the basis of intelligence and prosecutorial collection of evidence as basis for arrest of die-hard enemies or punitive operations in urban areas by the NPA. The critique of conservatism covers these matters. You are correct in saying that since the Second Great Rectification movement in the 1990s, the NPA has dramatically expanded its guerrilla fronts and its ability to withstand fierce repression and counterinsurgency campaigns, including psychological warfare and aerial bombings. But I think that when a guerrilla front is under attack by a superior enemy force, the NPA in the same guerrilla front should try to inflict sure damage to the attacking enemy force during its advance, encampment, and withdrawal, and should also be able to carry out its own offensives in the guerrilla zones previously opened up by mass work in order to increase the arms of the guerrilla front. Of course, when a guerrilla front is under attack, the other guerrilla fronts should also take initiative of making their own offensives, and if already available, rural-based NPA teams can be deployed for arrest of enemy diehards and punitive operations in the urban areas and along major highways. The clamor for various types of NPA offensives has been rising because of the so many campaigns of mass murders being committed by the reactionary military and police forces against innocent civilians and against old cadres of more than 70 years old who had participated in peace negotiations and retired from the battlefield under the terms of the GRP-NDFP Joint Agreement on Safety and Immunity Guarantees. With regard to the question of guerrilla warfare, in which the enemy uses drones and attack helicopters, I can refer to the victory of the Taliban against the US, where despite the fact that the Taliban had no Stingers to use against the drones, helicopters, and other aircraft of the US and its puppets in Afghanistan from 2001 from 2020 to 2021, the Taliban simply relied on its political work and its ground-to-ground firepower in order to destroy the US and puppet personnel and installations on the ground. Nevertheless, the NPA has so far withstood what you call the 21st century methods of counter-revolution. Duterte has failed to destroy the NPA with its dependence on US high technology for collecting and analyzing information, use of drones and attack helicopters, ground spies, and ground troops. In the guerrilla fronts of the CPA-NPA, the local organs of political power are established and constitute the People's Democratic Government under the guidelines for establishing the People's Government. They are committees which consist of representatives of the CPP, NPA, and the revolutionary mass organizations of workers, peasants, youth, women, and others. They elect their own executive officers. They form subcommittees in charge of planning and implementing public education and mass organizing, land reform, social and economic development, finance, cultural affairs, self-defense, disaster relief, and environmental protection. The barangay residents and the members of the revolutionary mass organizations supporting the people's government run into tens of millions in the entire country. The grave crisis and rottenness of the semi-colonial and semi-feudal ruling system are manifested by the treasonous, brutal, and corrupt presidency of Duterte and the installation of Marcos Jr. as president and Sara Duterte as vice president through massive, automated electoral cheating. Every day that these usurpers of authority are in power, they are being discredited by their own dynastic records of treason, state terrorism, and plunder, and by the new wave of crimes of repression and plunder that they are committing. The broad masses of the people will become more outraged than ever before and will condemn and resist the escalating conditions of oppression and exploitation. U.S. imperialism expects Marcos Jr. to continue the Duterte policy of suppressing the revolutionary movement. He will certainly use the so-called anti-terror law to suppress the entire range of opposition in order to legalize the previous ill-gotten wealth of the Marcoses and accumulate more wealth at the expense of the people. The toiling masses of workers and peasants who are the most oppressed and exploited will be driven to join the armed revolution for national and social liberation. The middle social strata of the urban petty bourgeoisie and middle bourgeoisie will be further encouraged to join the ranks of the patriotic and democratic forces. The reactionary classes of big compradors, landlords, and bureaucrat capitalists will continue to split, factionalize, and compete for the spoils in the ruling system and for the favor of the U.S. and other foreign monopoly interests. I agree with you that an exemplary feature of the Philippine Revolution and the Communist Party's leadership is the continued practice of two-line struggle and rectification campaigns to stay on the revolutionary road. Indeed, rectification campaigns have helped the CPP stay on the revolutionary road and have been able to prevent splits and setbacks from undermining and weakening the fighting will and capabilities of the revolutionary movement. At the moment, the CPP continues to lead the third rectification movement to combat conservatism. It admonishes against self-satisfaction and passivity with achievements and mass work, in raising resources for these and in having peace and calm in certain localities while others are under enemy attack. To be truly revolutionary in the current circumstances, all revolutionary forces and units and their CPP cadres and NPA commanders and fighters can always find ways of raising their armed strength by fighting the enemy. The expansion of the mass base ought to enable more tactical offensives and provide more ways for security for elderly comrades who are already non-combatants but are being butchered by the cowardly enemy. The cadres and social scientists of the CPP have constantly monitored, confronted, and critiqued in publications and study sessions the various trends of subjectivist idealism, such as postmodernism and anti-communism, which are promoted in the bourgeois academies and internet in North America and Europe and are echoed to some extent by a few petty bourgeois intellectuals in the Philippines. At any rate, there are relatively far more bourgeois reformists in the imperialist-funded non-governmental organizations and Trotskyites and crypto-Trotskyites bred by their masters in various capitalist countries. I have recently done my bit of ideological combat by publishing the book on the philosophy of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and including my critiques of subjectivist idealism. I have also written articles on the Frankfurt School, Austrian School, French postmodernism, the British analytic philosophy, and so on. I have repeatedly pointed out the rapid worsening crisis of the world capitalist system since the financial meltdown of 2008, the unraveling of the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the U.S., the conspicuous U.S. strategic decline, the big break between the US and China since the second decade of the 21st century, and in recent years, the upsurge of anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggles on a world scale as the prelude to the resurgence of socialism. The addition of two new imperialist powers, China and Russia, to the traditional imperialist powers headed by the US has aggravated inter-imperialist contradictions and the crisis of the world capitalist system. But we have to consider that real subjective factors such as real communist parties, trade unions, and other mass formations, people's armies, and other revolutionary forces must re-emerge on a global scale through anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggles in order to make up for and supersede so many previous decades of revisionist betrayal and capitalist restoration in former socialist countries, and the total discredit of so many revisionist parties and their variants outside of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and China. After the Dengist counter-revolution in China from 1976 onward and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, U.S. imperialism and its followers declared the end of history with the supposed permanent death of socialism and the perpetuity of capitalism and liberal democracy. For some 2 decades since 1991, the U.S. claimed to be the sole superpower for being winner in the Cold War and recklessly expanded the NATO and engaged in ceaseless wars. Now, the strategic decline of the U.S. in a multipolar world is becoming more and more obvious after spending 10 trillion US dollars for wars of aggression. The US-China inter-imperialist contradictions came to the surface during the Obama regime when the US complained against the economic and military rise of China and decided to carry out the strategic US pivot to East Asia and excluded China from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The contradictions became even more conspicuous when the Trump regime started to cut down China's exports to the US, shift U.S. investments from China to other countries, and accuse China of manipulating economic, trade, and currency policies and stealing technology from U.S. companies and research institutes. The inter-imperialist contradictions between the U.S. and China will become worse from year to year. In recent years, Duterte thought that if he sidled up to China and let it build artificial islands and military bases in the West Philippine Sea, he could borrow from China 24 billion US dollars for infrastructure projects. But China delivered to him only a little over 1 billion US dollars. I think that the US will keep the Marcos regime under tighter control. Even in the last year in power, Duterte had to prove utter subservience to the U.S. and agreed to make Marcos Jr. the president by fraudulent vote count. At this time, the CPP considers it very important to develop the International Anti-Imperialist United Front and seek allies among countries that declare themselves as anti-imperialist and fully independent and as socialist, like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and Venezuela, or as having socialist programs and aspirations the CPP is happy to have relations with countries that consider themselves independent, anti-imperialist, and willing to support the Philippine Revolution. It would be politically counterproductive for the CPP to pose publicly as the ideological arbiter of whichever countries are truly socialist or not. But the CPP keeps on studying from history and current circumstances what constitutes scientific socialism and what is the socialist perspective of the People's Democratic Revolution. When the CPP wins the People's Democratic Revolution, it will certainly announce how it shall start the socialist revolution in the Philippines. In the meantime, the CPP fervently wishes and hopes that more countries shall become socialist as a consequence of the growing anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggles. The CPP wants to maintain the distinction between ideological and political tasks. By way of strengthening the vanguard part of the proletariat and the mass movement led by the Communist Party, ideological work has to be done on whatever scale of propagation that is used. Certainly within the scale of the Philippine Party and the revolutionary mass movement, the CPP would make sure that its performance of the ideological task does not destroy the accomplishment of the political task of developing relations of proletarian internationalism among genuine communist parties, as well as solidarity alliance against imperialism among all sorts of parties. So that is in the realm of there's no use if the purity, ideological purity of Marxism-Leninism applied within the party without any doubt, would be extended to political relations which involve relating even to non-communist entities, especially at this time when there are no big socialist countries. There is a downturn in the accomplishment of the world proletarian revolution. There is a need to make sure that we have the wide political base for the resurgence of the socialist cause on a world scale. I have been abroad since the later part of 1986, and I have met with representatives of all sorts of parties. Within such a long period of more than 3 decades, some of them have retained or changed their ideological positions. Representatives of the CPP and the NDAP must have observed the same phenomena of persons and even entire parties changing their ideological positions. In my experience as a Marxist-Leninist Maoist, I was an active anti-revisionist participant in the Brussels Communist Seminar while it lasted from the 1990s to the early years of the 21st century. I was also the chairman of the International Conference of Marxist-Leninist parties and organizations which propagated Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought. Then from 1998 to 2001, I chaired the International Preparatory Committee that established the International League of People's Struggle. I became its general consultant from 2001 to 2004, and then as chairperson from 2004 to 2019. The ILP has been basically an alliance of people's organizations struggling for national liberation, democracy, and socialism against imperialism, revisionism, and all reaction. In the elementary grades, specifically in grade 3, I became interested in reading and trying to write poetry. I was inspired by the poems my teacher asked me to recite. In high school at the Ateneo in Letran, I succeeded in having some of my poems published in the school publications. And of course, in the University of the Philippines, I published my poems in the Philippine Collegian and in various literary publications. I published my first book of poems in 1961 when I was 22 years old. To say the least, we were a significant part of and had an impact on the generation that created the overall global upsurge of the 1960s with the leadership and guidance of Mao Zedong thought or Maoism. We wrote poems and performed other tasks, ideological, political, and organizational, in order to generate the People's Democratic Revolution with a socialist perspective in our respective countries. We became engaged in the revolutionary mass struggles and in waging the People's War. I consider myself the luckiest of those leaders you have mentioned because I have lived long enough to observe and study the rise of modern revisionism and neoliberalism for some decades, the unprecedented crisis of global capitalism and strategic decline of the U.S., the current upsurge of anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggles, and the discernible transition to the resurgence of the socialist cause. I was sustained by the commitment to the just cause of serving the oppressed and exploited people in their struggle for national and social liberation. My studies of theory and practice of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, my participation in the mass struggles, and readiness to die anytime, if necessary, sustained me. And of course, I composed poems to counter the psychological torture during my 5 years of solitary confinement. My most difficult experiences included being deprived of employment since 1988 and even the living allowance for asylum seekers since 2003, while I was waging legal battles for political asylum after my Philippine passport was cancelled in 1988, for the dismissal of the trumped-up charges of multiple murder in 2007, and for the removal of my name from the EU terrorist list. I won all these cases, and I enjoyed the support of my lawyers, the Filipino compatriots overseas and in the motherland, and the organizations and institutions of foreign friends in solidarity with the Filipino people. This is what sustained me, my commitment to the principles of the revolutionary proletariat and the just struggle of the Filipino people for national and social liberation. I, I don't know, did I say 56? No, it has to be clapped. I have. No, it's a long sentence, you know. The history of the class struggle for socialism is only how many centuries? A little over 2 centuries. In historical time, that is short, no? And we have already such a rich experience of the proletarian class struggle that no, in the next round, that might be too elaborate, no? I maintain my hope that the socialist cause will prevail.